So welcome everybody to the Champlain Valley 10 to 12 millimeter fruit set virtual thinning meeting. I see we are recording to the cloud. Thanks for catching that, Andy. So again, welcome to the meeting. I'd like to first start off by thanking Valent for supporting this thinning series. We appreciate their support. And as far as the meeting today, we're going to be discussing thinning during that 10 to 12 millimeter timing. We have Dr. Robinson with us today, but before we hear from him, I wanted to just share with you all what I saw as I've been looking around the Champlain Valley yesterday and today, just to kind of set the scene and talk about what I've been seeing as I've been going around. So looking at Honeycrisp in particular, to start, king fruits are kind of all over the place depending on which orchard you're looking at. I've been seeing anywhere from 4 to about 9 millimeters at this point, depending on the orchard. There has been some king damage, generally light. A couple spots are a bit more severe though. So again, I recommend having a look at your kings. And then as far as the level of thinning that we've seen, has really varied depending on if they were bloom thinned with ATS or not. So where ATS has gone on, we've seen some extensive thinning at this point. Where NAA was used at bloom, things are still a bit heavier. Generally speaking though, some blocks have few kings at this point, and some that have been thinned less aggressively still have kings with a lot of laterals still remaining in the clusters. Looking at Gala, their king size is anywhere from 5 to 8 millimeters at this point, and as we kind of expect with Gala, they still seem to be fairly heavily set up. I've noticed little king damage, and the laterals are all looking like they're growing pretty strongly at this point. Though it's still really too early to tell the results of the petal fall applications where they've gone out. So just want to keep that caveat in mind. I think we're going to need a couple more days to really start seeing that differentiation from those petal fall thinning applications. Looking at our Macintosh, kings are ranging anywhere from 4 to 9 millimeters. And looking at the clusters, laterals are anywhere from 1 to 5 laterals that still look to be growing within the cluster. So there's some variation in the amount that's still out there depending on how much thinning has been done on them at this point. And on Max, I've been seeing some weak kings here and there, not to the same extent that I have on Honeycrisp, but you can find some missing if you're looking. Looking at New York 1, they're ranging anywhere from 4 to 10 millimeters. And generally, kings are looking pretty good. And in most of the clusters, I'd say 3 to 4 laterals look like they're setting. And some of the orchards, though since this one tends to bloom a bit later, it's still too early to tell in some of the later sites. And I did notice that in general, there's been fairly spotty bloom in New York 1 this year, but for the most part, the king flowers have all looked pretty good from what I've been seeing. Cortland's at this point, the kings are anywhere from 4 to 9 millimeters. I've seen some occasional king loss, but not too extensive. And generally, anywhere from 1 to 4 of the lateral flowers are remaining in the cluster at this point. And McCowns are anywhere from 3 to 9 millimeters in size. Bloom on these pretty much across the board was pretty heavy this year. I have seen a couple weak kings here and there. And then as far as the laterals that are still out there, I'm seeing anywhere from 1 to 6 laterals still in a cluster. And then wrapping up with Fuji, those kings are about 5 to 7 millimeters. The kings in the cluster look pretty good to me. And the clusters look like they're pretty heavy. The laterals all seem to be setting up pretty strongly. So that's what I'm seeing at this point. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Robinson.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great time of the year where we can make these decisions about thinning. I think this is really the most stressful time of year also for some people, because this window coming up in the next few days could either make or break the season, depending on if we make a mistake and over thin. I want to emphasize that although it's stressful, we have 2 mathematical models to help us have a little more confidence in what we're doing. The first is a carbon balance model, and we'll talk about the results of that today. but you're going to need to run that for your area, your farm, on the day you spray. It really gives a lot of insight into what's going to happen and helps us decide how much chemical to put in the tank. The other is the fruit growth rate model. And I hope that some of you have been measuring fruit diameters now before this next spray comes up. So you can see the impact of either petal fall spray alone or the combination of the bloom and petal fall spray if you did bloom thinning. I also want to emphasize that in the last 2 years, we've been really pushing to time the spray for this 10 to 13 millimeter timing based on degree days after bloom, and you'll see when that's predicted to happen a couple of slides ahead. I want to support what Mike just reported and talk a little bit about some of the additional things about what's happened so far. The very warm weather during bloom pushed bloom out quickly. Good weather for bee flight, and it resulted generally in really good fruit set all over the Champlain Valley. If you applied blossom thinning sprays, it went on under very warm conditions. And it seems like that combination of the ATS and warm conditions resulted in significant thinning in some blocks. Now, the petal fall spray went on under more neutral carbohydrate balance conditions, cooler, and those sprays probably gave moderate thinning. It's still a bit early to determine the impact of the petal fall sprays. Mike has got some fruit growth rate measurements in various blocks where he's doing experiments, but he won't have the second measurement until Tuesday to then really assess what happened with the petal fall spray. If you're going to spray before then, I would say that you should assume that there was only moderate thinning from that petal fall spray. Differently, the next spray is scheduled to go on during very warm conditions in the 80s or high 80s. And this will likely give very strong thinning. And so there is some reason to have some caution and to make sure that we know what we're doing before we go out on this next spray. I want to show the results from the carbon balance model as of a few hours ago when I ran it for the Peru weather station. You'll notice that it starts in April at green tip, and that all the time since April all the way through full bloom, the carbon balance has been negative. If we set full bloom on May the 14th, it was during a period of quite serious deficit, and blossom thinners would have gone on a few days before that full bloom date, right at the lowest point of carbon deficit under heat, which is why we got substantial thinning out of the ATS this year. As we move forward, the petal fall window occurred when the temperatures were cooler and the carbon balance deficit had pretty much disappeared. And there was like one day where we had a positive carbon balance. But since then, we've had this declining average of carbon balance. And yesterday and today and tomorrow, we'll have average deficits around the -25 level. Now, to get a view of when this thinning window for the 10 to 13 millimeters will open, let's look at the table in the bottom. The table in the bottom has these black squares around the degree days for the window for this thinning at this time. So we'll get to 200 degree days on May the 29th, which is day after tomorrow, which is Sunday. So the window, according to degree days, will open up Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and I'm going to include Wednesday because it's just past the 250 degree days. The model does not give us predictions that far forward because we only have 7 days of forecast. And so once we get 2 days of forecast, we can't predict the average because we don't have enough days forward on the daily. But it's looking like from what's happened in the last yesterday, today, and tomorrow, that we're in this sort of brown colored situation, which will give great thinning. Daily deficits, today substantially minus 86, paired by 17 and minus 28, for an average somewhere between minus 25 and minus 30. So if you sprayed yesterday or today or tomorrow, you would expect very good thinning. And the model indicates that if you would have sprayed yesterday, today, or tomorrow, you should have decreased your rates a little bit by 15%. Now, what will happen in these days moving forward, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we'll have to wait and see. But this indicates that you need to run the model on the day you spray, then you'll have the most precise data. If we look over here at the forecasted temperatures, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, these 80 degrees, mid 80s, with nighttime temperatures in the 60s, will probably give very significant thinning. I don't want to scare anybody, but I'm pretty sure that the carbohydrate model will indicate to decrease rate by about 15%, or using a little bit of caution. Now that is not meant to dissuade anybody from thinning, because I'm pretty sure that almost every block needs some additional thinning. Let me try to summarize a little bit from what I gather from those graphs in that table. Based upon what Mike measured, the larger fruits in each of these varieties in the Prue area are 7, 8, and 9. So if we talk about Max and Snapdragon and McCowan's being 9 millimeters, they will grow almost a millimeter per day under this heat, or it's not really hot, but the heat that will be coming. And so that will mean that by Monday, Memorial Day, we will be at least 3 millimeters larger. And that will put us right at 12 millimeters for some of these, and others at 11 millimeters. So that will be pretty much the optimum timing to spray them. But there's several cautions. Mike has picked up, and I haven't been there to see it myself, but that there has been some damage to king blossoms. And in some cases, the king fruit is smaller than the laterals. Now, this damage to the kings likely was due to some event in the winter or spring, early spring. I haven't been able to nail it down yet, but recognizing that it's out there means that we have to take that into account when we decide at what timing to thin. So I want to thin when the biggest fruit within the cluster, whether it's the king or one of the laterals, is getting to 12 to 13 millimeters. I'm guessing that's going to start on Monday, and either Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday would be the preferred dates to spray. Now, it appears from Mike's trials that blossom thinning with ATS this particular year caused significant thinning in some blocks. And I think that has to be assessed before deciding how much additional thinner to put on. Well, you can look at it and see in some cases, but the best scientific way to assess that is by measuring fruitlet diameters. There's still time to measure the first measurement today and come back on Monday and measure a second measurement and have a precise estimate of how many fruits are still growing strong enough to make it to harvest. But without those measurements, it's a little bit difficult to make the decision on Monday as to what to spray. Lacking those measurements, I think you have to make a careful assessment of fruit set in each block. The things that I would look for were first to see if the king is present, and then assess whether it's the largest in the cluster or whether one of the laterals is larger. Secondly, I would assess the number of viable fruits that seem to be growing within each cluster. Are you down to 1? Do you have 2? Do you have 4? If we have 3 or 4 fruits still growing, there still needs to be significant thinning, because normally we need only 1 fruit per cluster. Or in some cases where we have a lot of bloom, we might need only 1 fruit in every other cluster. And so having 2, 3, 4, or even 5 fruits in a cluster requires a significant thinning in this round. And that's probably the case with all the galas. So I want to give some suggestions that I hope that you'll sort of memorize. It seems to me that the best window opens on Sunday, May 29th, and then goes through Wednesday, June 1st. Any one of those days where it's not too windy and not rainy would be a great day to spray your chemical thinner. All of them are going to be warm. So those high temperatures, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, will probably give an average carbohydrate balance of around minus 25, minus 30. That level of deficit will give strong thinning. That probably suggests a little bit more moderate rates. It will indicate that Maxell will do a great job with those warm temperatures for thinning Gala, for thinning Snapdragon, for thinning Fuji, for thinning Red Delicious. With Honeycrisp, it seems like that if you sprayed Blossom thinners, you got pretty good thinning from it. And that combined with the petal fall spray means that you need probably relatively little additional thinning, and that with the right dose on this round, you could essentially have near perfect thinning and no additional thinning will be required. So that's what I'm hoping that we're able to achieve. With a 15% reduction in rate, that we would have near perfect thinning with Honeycrisp. However, with Gala, because it's so strongly set, this spray will probably not be enough. So even if you put on a full dose on this spray, you're probably going to have to spray an additional rescue spray a week later. The options for chemicals and some of my suggested rates are listed on this slide. Now, 7 alone with some oil is a very potent thinner under heat, and it's very common in Pennsylvania, not so common up here. Mostly here in New York, we like the combinations of either Maxell and 7 or NAA and 7. If you're a grower that wants to eliminate carbaryl from your spray program for a marketing program that doesn't accept carbaryl or 7, then the combination of Maxell and NAA has seemed to work very well to achieve good thinning. So for this year, I'm suggesting that Maxell be used on Gala at 64 ounces on a tree row volume dilute basis and 1 pint of carbaryl per 100. Now I'm going to explain in my next slide what I mean by 64 ounces tree row volume dilute. For Honeycrisp, I'm suggesting that it be an NAA-based thinning program, and at this time, the 3 ounces per 100 on a tree row volume dilute basis is our suggestion. We've had really good luck with New York 1 using Maxell at the relatively high rate of 64 ounces. With Macintosh, we like a modest dose of NAA, just 2 ounces on a tree row volume dilute basis and a pint of carbaryl. Empire seems to react really well to Maxell, and over the years, Maxell at 64 ounces has been the best spray approach. Not many Delicious grown in the Champlain, but there and with Fuji, both those varieties need to use Maxell because NAA tends to give pygmy fruit. I'd like to just spend a few minutes on this slide to make sure we're all on the same page about how to properly calculate the amount of either NAA or Maxell that goes in a spray tank. The rates that I gave you on the previous slide are all tree row volume dilute suggestions. Thus, the amount of chemical that you add to a full spray tank needs to be calculated. I'm going to give 2 examples. The first example is the 3 ounces per 100 of NAA that I would like to see on Honeycrisp. And the second example is the 64 ounces of Maxell on Gala. These 2 are what we used to talk in parts per million, the 7.5 parts per million with NAA or 100 parts per million with Maxell. The first step in calculating how much of these 2 chemicals goes in a spray tank is to calculate the concentration factor, which is the ratio between the tree row volume of the orchard and the amount you actually spray. So first, each orchard would have to be measured and a tree row volume calculated, and then this concentration factor calculated, which is simply the ratio of tree row volume to the volume of spray you actually put out. Let's give 2 examples. For a fully grown tall spindle orchard or a slightly lower density fully grown orchard. Often they measure requiring 200 gallons to fully cover the trees with a dilute spray. But nobody carries 200 gallons to every acre anymore. Many people carry only half the water. So let's assume for this example, you're carrying 100 gallons. So the ratio between 200 and 100 is 2. So the concentration factor is 2. Now, many snapdragon blocks never fill the space enough to be 200-gallon trees. Often they're at maturity only 150-gallon trees. So in the second example, which is probably applicable to snapdragon or young orchards, if the tree row volume is 150 and you're spraying 100, then the concentration factor is 1.5. Once you have the concentration factor, you multiply my suggested rates I showed you on the previous slide by the concentration factor to get the rate per acre. Let's use the example of NAA. I had suggested for Honeycrisp to spray 3 ounces of NAA per 100. Well, the concentration factor is 2, like we calculated up here, which means that 3 times 2 is 6 ounces of NAA per acre. Now, since I'm spraying 100 gallons to the acre and my sprayer holds 500 gallons, I can cover 5 acres with a spray tank. So I'm putting 6 ounces on every acre and I'm spraying 5 acres. So 30 ounces goes in the spray tank, 6 times 30. So once you have this number, then look at the carbohydrate model. Right now, it's suggesting we reduce rates by 15%. So if this was the amount you would put on normally, then reduce it by 15% means that you would put in the spray tank only 25.5 ounces, not 30. So this reduction of 15% is critical if we stick with this carbohydrate deficits when you run the model on Monday before you spray. Let's look at the Maxell example for Gala. If I suggested 64 ounces on the previous slide and the concentration factor is 2, that means that 64 times 2 is 128 ounces, which is essentially 1 gallon. And I can spray that on an acre, but I have the capacity with my sprayer to spray 5 acres with 1 spray tank. Therefore, 1 gallon times 5 means 5 gallons of Maxell on a sprayer. If I want to reduce that by 15%, then that would turn out to be 4.25 gallons in a spray tank. So these are just 2 examples. There's all kinds of other permutations, especially when the concentration factor is not 2. It might be 1.5 or it might be 3. An example would be a person who doesn't even want to carry 100 gallons per acre. He wants to spray only 75 gallons or 50 gallons. If your tree row volume is 200 and you're only carrying 75 gallons to every acre, then your factor is going to be a little less than 3. But having that concentration factor allows you to multiply it by my rates to get the rate per acre, and then however many acres you cover with your sprayer determines how much goes in each spray tank. Now, lastly, I want to comment that I don't suggest you use this concentration factor for adjusting the amount of carbaryl that you put in the tank or surfactants if you use them, although I don't think you should put any surfactants in this year. The reason for this is that carbaryl has a very limited solubility in water, and its maximum solubility is about 1 pint per 100. If you use a concentration factor and you take that 1 pint and multiply it by 2, you're putting in 2 pints per 100. But the second pint is not in solution. It simply is kept in suspension by the agitation in your tank, sprayed out on the leaf, but the leaf cannot absorb it because it can only absorb what's in solution. So that second pint just gets deposited on the leaf and sits there and acts as an insecticide. But if you get dews or light rains, it re-wets that 7 and more is absorbed. And you can get substantial greater thinning. I had a sad case in Western New York this year that a petal fall, the grower went ahead and doubled up on the 7, and it turns out that he's over thinned his Honeycrisp because of this extra 7 that was out there. That's the basic view of what's going to happen in the next few days. I want to really encourage you to run the carbohydrate model on the day you spray because forecasts change. Who knows if what they're forecasting now will actually come to pass on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday and Wednesday when you'll be spraying. It's very easy to use. You can find the carbohydrate model on the NUA Cornell website, or you can find it on the malusim.org website, or you can download the phone app from either the Apple store or the Android store and use it on your phone. I put this caution up there. I don't think it's going to happen this year, but if we were to get a serious deficit of -60 or more negative than that, it's really dangerous to spray, and you should not spray, because -60 will cause thinning all on its own. And so if you spray on top of that kind of deficit, you always get over thinning. The main goal with the carbohydrate model is to prevent over thinning. I want you to remember that this is the timing when all thinners, whether it's NAA, Maxell, or Carbaryl, have their strongest effect. But that means they're also risky at this timing. That leads me to put a little bit of caution out there that right now it looks like that we'll be facing a significant carbohydrate deficit in the Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday timeframe. And so it would be probably appropriate to reduce the rate that I've given you by 15%. But I want to say again, if that temperatures don't materialize and you look at the model on Sunday morning, Monday morning, Tuesday morning, and it says don't reduce the rates, then don't reduce the rates, because then you will need the full rate. So that's why it's so important to run the model right before you spray. It's important to try to assess what will happen after this coming spray quickly as possible. And the best way to do that is to measure fruitlet diameters. Tag 15 spurs on each of 5 trees, measure the diameter after 50-degree days have passed, and then remeasure when 110 degrees have passed. Plug that information into the Malusim phone app fruit growth rate model, and you'll get an answer immediately. I want you to use the Malusim, either malusim.org from your laptop or the Malusim phone app, because both of those have error detection protocols that will help prevent errors from giving you a false answer. I want to go back to this slide showing what's predicted to happen in Peru, showing that on May 28th, we'll enter this, May 29th actually, because this was the one I ran a day ago. But there's a period of time when if you sprayed on, say, May 28th, you could just look forward about, in this case, only about 3 days to make your first measurement. And then probably 3 days after that, you'd make your second measurement, because with heat, you accumulate degree days pretty fast. I want to then just share this slide that came out of Western New York, because we don't have this data yet in the Champlain Valley, but this was quite sobering yesterday when I got this data. I show here 2 blocks of Honeycrisp. One block had about 1,000 potential fruits on the tree. Now, if each cluster has 5 fruits, it was pruned to about 250 clusters per tree. And it received both a bloom and a petal fall spray. And so in preparation for the 12-millimeter spray, we measured diameters twice, and it looks like that we had come down from the 1,000 potential fruits down to 300. However, the target number in this block was 100, basically 95 fruits, basically 100. So we still had 3 times as many Honeycrisp growing as we wanted. And so it looked like a lot had thinned off, but we still have 3 times as many fruits and requires an additional spray. But this grower is in pretty decent shape. And I think with one more spray, we'll be able to be very close to the target of 95 fruits per tree. The second example was just discouraging. This grower did not prune like we had suggested with precision pruning. And this is the on year. And so the potential number of fruits is 2,500. So every tree had about 500 clusters on it. That's way more than what we recommend you leave after pruning. We've been saying now very clearly you should prune down to 200 or less on Honeycrisp every year. And these trees had 500. What's happened? Both a bloom and a petal fall spray has reduced the number of fruits considerably from 2,500 to 900. but this grower also wants a little more than 100 fruits, 125 fruits. But that difference is 7 times. So these fruits have 7 times as many apples as they should. That means that the thinning will, this next round of thinning probably won't even get this grower close. But what's most discouraging, 900 fruits at this moment in time on the trees producing gibberellins, which are anti-flowering hormones, will almost certainly result in no bloom next year. And the grower is in this box, and at this time, there's no way out of it. This indicates why you really have to pay attention on the pruning, and so you don't end up in this situation. You know, I can already tell that next year this grower will really be sad. Now, I don't have data for Gala yet, but just looking at the Gala, the little bit of data we got from from Mike from the Albany area indicates that Gala still have 4 times as many fruits as desired. And I would predict that's the way it is in the Champlain. So both of these indicate that even though we probably had good thinning at bloom and at petal fall, we still probably need thinning on Honeycrisp. Now, Mike has indicated he's going to take his second measurements on Tuesday, and we'll have almost immediately, probably Tuesday by noon, information on Honeycrisp and how it looks in his trials. It might be wise to just wait and see that data before you start spraying. But if you start before, you've just got to make the assessment yourself. So with that both a caution to be careful about rates, but also to encourage you to not be too cautious, because it appears there's a lot of Honeycrisp fruit still out there and a lot of Gala fruit. Let me summarize with this slide. Because of the damage to kings this year that we've seen in some blocks, I think it's critical to assess each block and each variety. Look for whether the kings are present, and then determine if it is the largest fruit in the cluster at this point in time, because if it's not doing well, a lateral will have already outgrown it. Secondly, assess how many fruits in the cluster appear to be growing. We need only 1, or we need only 1 for every other cluster. And because of that, we've got to knock off the laterals. Time your spray with this 200 and 250 degree days, which will open up Monday through Wednesday. Then measure fruitlet diameters about 3 days later and about 6 days later after that spray, and then decide whether you could or need a rescue spray. It's important to calculate the proper amount of thinner to add to each spray tank using the correct concentration factor. Now, number 4 is another suggestion we make about nozzling. Over the years, we've always said that about the nozzles should be set up so that only 1/3 of the spray goes to the bottom part of the half of the tree and 2/3 to the top. But studies that I did right before I left on leave and that Pollyanna continued showed that even with that, we often overthin the bottom, and there's more fruit in the top than in the bottom. We tested various other ratios, and the one that we like is to nozzle the sprayer so that 75% of the spray goes to the top half of the tree and only 25% to the bottom. There's always drift down, even when you nozzle this way. But if you could take the time and the effort to re-nozzle your sprayer before this upcoming spray, you'll be much happier with the distribution of fruit on the tree. Now, surfactants like Regulate can increase the response of NAA, and on cold years or where you have carbohydrate surplus, maybe they're real helpful. But this year, with significant carbohydrate deficit, I encourage you not to add Regulate to any of your spray mixes. If you have to come back with a rescue spray, then you will need to add oil, because the fruits end up being very insensitive to thinners once they get to 18 millimeters. And we have to have that additional help from the oil. But for now, stay away from any surfactants or any oil in the tank. With that summary, I want to end my presentation and thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Terence. We do have a couple questions in the chat box that I could go through. And then once we have answered those, I would also invite anyone else to enter their questions in, or you could ask directly as well. So I had a question come in. So today I held off on thinning sprays because the daily carb balance was negative in the mid 80s. When you talk about avoiding thinning at huge carb deficits, are you referring to individual day deficits or the 7-day weighted average?
The
I,
7-day weighted average is more important. And for this reason, we did a number of studies with Alan Laxo where we artificially created carbon balance deficits. And a single day does not knock fruit off. The tree seems to be able to resist one day of -80. But 2 days, and especially 3 days of those very low values will cause fruit to naturally shed. And so that's why we have this average in there, because it will helpfully eliminate the worry about a single day. Pay attention to the 7-day average.
all right. Is there a minimum for the single day that you would be concerned about, or really just focusing on that 7-day?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know. I think if I get in the minus hundreds, which we've had, and it generally came when we had in the 90-degree temperatures with warm nights with some cloudy weather. This lack of sunshine is the killer. The fruits or the trees don't produce enough carbohydrate. So if I see minus hundreds, I generally would probably wait it out till it moderated before I sprayed.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Recommendations for Cortlands that are 300 TRV range for the 10 to 13 millimeter stage. They are full clusters, but the trees were pruned pretty hard this spring. And he mentioned he thinks NAA was the only recommendation in the past.
Yeah, there's two parts to that question I want to answer. The first is larger trees that still exist are a little bit of a challenge. So what I do and what I should have emphasized and made clear is I put an upper limit on when I calculate tree row volume to calculate the concentration factor of 200. So if they measure 300, I'm just going to call them 200. And if I'm spraying 100 gallons, I'm going to use a concentration factor of 2 to adjust the amount of NAA I put in the tank. That's because these big trees that are 300-gallon trees are generally on more vigorous rootstocks, which thin a little bit easier. And so we don't want to try to thin them as hard as we do M9s or some of the Geneva rootstocks or B9s. So that's my first point. Just set an upper limit. Any tree that measures more than 200, just call it 200 when calculating the concentration factor and how much you're going to put in the tank. The second part is which chemicals. Now, I prefer a strictly NAA only based program for Cortland. I've had bad experiences when I include carbaryl because it seems like they continue to thin off big fruits. And so you get it to where you think it's right, and then fruits keep falling. That's because of the rewetting of NAA, or not, I'm sorry, the rewetting of carbaryl. NAA goes on, it's absorbed by the plant, it's metabolized, and it's gone. And so you don't get additional long-term thinning out of it. So I would suggest the NAA only program, but if they're set up as heavy as you say, I would certainly be willing to put in 2.5 ounces per 100 on the Cortlands in this heat to get the type of thinning I want.
All right, thank you, Terence. Are there any other questions for Terence? Feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat box, or at this point, you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask him directly.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so my one last question I have is about adjusting for the where in the tree the spray is going. Do you think it's a bad idea to drop below that 100 GPA sort of wetting? Like my question is, can I like cheat and shut off some bottom nozzles till I get to like a nice like 75 GPA or something like that? Like shoot for a nice number that's easy to, divide the NAA or the max L into, or do you think too little water in the mix is a problem?
I think that's a great question, Jesse. And the very quick answer is you can reduce the water to less than 100 without any negative consequences. And I'll tell you just a little bit of a story. So with 300-gallon trees, people would go to half the water, which is 150, and then they went to 100 gallons, and then some went to 75, and some went to 50. With each one of those reductions in water, the concentration factor kept going up. So we did a study on the concentration factor. The same total grams of chemical went on per acre, but with different amounts of water. Anywhere between a concentration factor of 2 and 4 gave us essentially the same response. But when we went to really high concentration factors of 5 or 6, it was a little bit dicey. And so I've said now for many years that you can concentrate water to where it's concentration factor of 3 or concentration factor of 4. I kind of like a concentration factor of 2, but 3 or 4 is also good. So let me just use the example. Let's suppose you take my advice, and even if they're 300-gallon trees, you're just calling them 200. And you shut off nozzles where you go down to 75 gallons instead of 100 on the bottom part of the tree nozzles. Then when you calculate your concentration factor, you have 200 divided by 75. I'm doing it real quick here on my calculator. It turns out a concentration factor of 2.7. So you just use a concentration factor of 2.7. So a little more NA goes in the tank, but it's coming out of all those upper nozzles and fewer bottom nozzles. But you adjusted the right amount of chemical, so you're getting the same amount of chemical per acre. What I don't like is when people just shut off nozzles, but they still use the same concentration factor they were before. So they were applying 100 before and had a concentration factor of 2, then they shut off nozzles, but they don't recalculate the concentration factor. Does that make any sense, Jesse?
Yeah, because we're going to be, if we're shutting off nozzles and everything else remains the same, we're going to be taking the sprayer through a lot more acres. So
Exactly.
we have to adjust the per acre
Yeah.
rate. So that makes sense. Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, any other final questions? All right, well, not seeing any. I do just want to put into the chat box, again, the link to the apple carbohydrate thinning model is right there. Feel free to copy that down. And again, just to reiterate Terrence's point, things can very likely change between now and Sunday. So before you go out and start mixing up a tank, we recommend you check it for your site that day so that you can adjust it accordingly.
Good luck, everybody.
All right. With that, thank you, Terrence. And for the rest of you, if you'd like to stick around, I am going to talk about a couple different pest management talking points before you go. But thank you again, Terrence. All right, so just bear with me, folks. If you'd like to stick around, I'm just going to talk about a couple other quick things before we call the meeting adjourned for the day. Let's see, I'll go ahead and share my screen and I can show you what I'm looking at here. So just to kind of reiterate those points that Terence was discussing there, I did want to talk about some of the different model outputs for some of the different stations. So here I put in Granville as an example of an earlier site. Their full bloom date was May 14th. So you can see they're going to be entering that window starting tomorrow, and they'll be out of it by around the 30th or as late as the 31st. Again, the one that Terence just showed us for Peru using that full bloom date of Honeycrisp of May 15th. Again, we'll be getting into it about the 30th and getting out of it sometime around Wednesday or so. And looking down a little bit further, I also put in Shazy for our Northern Clinton County site, and they'll be entering a little bit later after that as well. And of course, again, just reiterating the point that as those dates shift, the output's going to shift as well. So definitely each day, go ahead and run the model for your specific site, for your specific bloom date to make sure you're getting it as accurately as possible. So just to go through some IPM really quick, you've probably seen a lot of this in an alert already, but I just want to reiterate it. As far as apple scab is concerned, we are in the middle of a pretty big infection event. New is predicting about a 20% discharge going on now through Sunday. So hopefully everybody was able to cover up ahead of that. But if not, you can come back in with something that has good kickback when you have a good window of opportunity to get a spray on. Following this infection, New is predicting that we're going to be at about 97% spore discharge. So we may still have another small event after that, but we're we're getting near the end of primary season. But even then, we still like to recommend that you keep covered for another 2 weeks past the end of primary, just in case NUA missed anything, just to really give you that extra bit of insurance that you're going to be covered through all of primary. So shifting over to Fireblade, I know it's been quite the season for Fireblade, and it looks like we're not quite out of it yet. Driving around, you can still find a couple blooms open here and there. And right now, Fireblight risk is high according to the EIP model on NUA. We do still have some open blooms, and we do have some wetting periods coming. So I just want to reiterate again, hopefully you've been able to get more strep on wherever you have blooms open, where we think an infection is likely. But if you haven't yet, we do expect about 24 hours of kickback from strep. So if some of these rains, well, we've already had some rains today, so they are materializing. So you do have time to go back out and cover up if you haven't had the opportunity to get strep on 48 hours ahead of that event or within 48 hours of that event. So in addition to getting those strep sprays on, I do just want to reiterate as well, keep an eye out for blossom and shoot blight if and when they show up. The sooner we find it, the sooner we can react, the sooner we can clean it up. So we want to be, if we do see strikes in the shoots, we want to prune those out on cool, dry days. And another program that we would recommend considering is an apogee program. And with that one, we want to get that on as soon as possible, because the sooner we get that on before the shoots really start taking off, the more likely we are to slow down that shoot growth and slow down the infection. So definitely really want to be vigilant when we expect to start seeing shoot blight showing up. And then in addition to that apogee application, another option after that is to use a Cueva double nickel program so that you can keep that shoot blight infection from spreading to other shoots in the orchard. And generally during the summertime, we recommend saving strep only for trauma blight events, such as if you have a hailstorm go through, that would be the time to use strep. But we really don't like to use it after petal fall, just because of the risk of strep resistance. And last year we did do some testing of different fire blight samples from around the county. We did find one case of resistance in one of our local orchards. We're hoping it was just a fluke, but we are going to be looking for fire blight samples to send again to do more resistance testing. So if you do find any strikes, please let me know. I'd be happy to come collect those strikes to send them to the lab, and we can see what strain of fire blight it is and if it's resistant at all. So I put my contact info there. Just give me a shout and I'd happily come and collect that for you. Blister spot, I don't think it's a particularly big issue in our region, but I did just want to put this on here. For those of you with New York 1 or Fuji or Matsu, blister spot can be an issue on these varieties, and generally the recommendation for this one would be applying one of the phosphoric acid products timed out about 10 to 14 days after petal fall. That should really help clean that up. So if you ever had an issue with blister spot, I don't think anyone's reported it to me, but if you have seen it in some of your New York 1, that would be one potential management recommendation for you. Powdery mildew, keep an eye out for strikes. We are seeing some powdery mildew in some of our more susceptible varieties. So checking your Cortland, your Honeycrisp, that's where we're going to really start to see it. And then the general recommendation from Carrick would be to rotate in a good mildew material on a roughly 12 to 14 day basis after your petal fall sprays, particularly on your susceptible varieties until you get through terminal bud set. Once the bud's set and we stop getting that new shoot growth, we're just going to have less new shoot material to be infected by it, so we can start lining up a bit more at that point. But again, we are seeing some of it popping up in the county now, so now is the time to be vigilant for it. Then getting out a little bit further ahead, I do just want to mention bitter rot. Once we get into late June, that's really going to be the time we want to start thinking about that. Again, Captan is fairly effective against it, but you'll also want to be rotating in some additional products that provide more protection against it. So there's a couple different products for that. Some of the different single sites like Aprovia, Flint Extra, Luna Sensation, these different materials are going to be really helpful in keeping bitter rot at bay if it does turn out to be another hot, humid year for us. Then as far as sooty blotch and fly speck goes, we have a newer model for that. So I recommend using that. You would enter in your petal fall date and it'll give you your general risk of sooty blotch and fly speck. And running the model today, we are still low in the Peru area for that. Then quickly shifting over to insects. Again, we recommend that plum curculio be managed until you've hit that 308 degree day mark. Once that occurs within 10 to 14 days of your most recent insecticide application. So checking the model for Peru today, we're only at 113. So obviously we still got a ways to go for plum curculio management. And again, you can check that model on a regular basis to see how far along you are. Then shifting over to our moth pests, keep an eye on your insect traps to help you time your applications. We caught our first OFM in our traps on May 17th in Peru, and our first codling moth came on May 19th. And then also obliques, the overwintering larvae are definitely out, and adults are also out there now too, which is quite a bit early for what we usually expect them to be. So definitely get your traps out for all three if you haven't yet at this point. And then just as an example, I did put in the output for the different models for Peru as of today. So you can see for Oriental fruit moth, we're currently at 169 degree days. And also put in the new output, which basically just tells us that your petal fall spray should have picked up that early bit of the larvae hatching. And then generally the second spray would be around first cover, 10 to 14 days after petal fall. Looking at codling moth, we're at about 113 degree days past, and the model just tells us that you want to get an ovicide out between 50 and 75, and then the timing for your larvicide would be about 100 to 200 degree days after hatch. And then for the OBLR output, basically it's just telling you to get your traps out at this point. Then moving along here, I also just want to get a note. I know a few orchards have had some issues with San Jose scale and woolly apple aphids, particularly the woolies the last couple seasons. So just a reminder that Movento applied at the petal fall, the first cover timing should help out quite a bit with these two pests as they start to hatch later in the season. The reason we want to get Movento out now before we actually start seeing them is that it's a systemic material, so it needs to be taken up and translocated through the plants to really do their job. So this would be the timing to get that material out. But if you want to wait until you start seeing crawlers and nymphs, there's other materials available. You can check those out in the guidelines. No, we don't have a ton of cherry growers up here, but we do have a new model for SWD. So if you do have a full bloom date for your cherries, let me know. I can run that model for you. If you're planning to replace an orchard block, if you're going to be taking trees out this fall, I am looking to do a project. It's going to be a 2-year orchard replant cover crop trial. So if you're interested in trying out different cover crops where you have a replant site, please let me know. I would be looking at using a sorghum Sudan grass mix along with a rapeseed, and we would do that as a rotation. And in particular, we want to do that in replant sites because it's supposed to help quite a bit with reducing nematodes and different fungal diseases that are associated with replant. So if you have a site and that timeline might work for you, please let me know. I'd be interested in having that trial locally here. And then finally, I did just want to touch base on weeds a little bit. Certainly in the last 2 weeks with all the heat we've had, weeds have really been shooting up. So just a reminder, I know they kind of are put on the back burner this time of year when we have everything else going on, but certainly keeping an eye on your weeds. They're getting to the point now where they're tall enough where a lot of the contact post-emergent materials that we have, like Ramoxone and Rely, are going to be less effective against them. So if you do still need to get out and use a post-emergent, we're probably going to need to be using higher rates of them just because the weeds are getting taller at this point. And then if you are planning to use a systemic material, I would just reiterate, it's really important to pay attention to the timings for the particular weeds that you're trying to treat. So if you look at the different labels for different products like glyphosate, if you're still using that, if you're using Stinger, they'll have very clear guidelines on the labels for when you want to be treating those particular perennial weeds at the right growth stage so that you can get as much control as you can. So just driving around, we have a lot of quackgrass up right now. We have a lot of different thistles up right now. So looking at the Stinger label, it'll tell you to treat thistle when they're between rosette to bud stage with stinger, which we're sort of in that timing now where they're still kind of early rosette. So that's just one example, but I think the key to getting good perennial weed control is to really pay attention to that timing. It's really critical, as is the weather conditions. We want it to be warm enough that it'll translocate through the plant, but not so hot and dry that the weeds are just shutting down and not moving it around. So just a few reminders for perennial weed management as well. So I know that was kind of the laundry list there. Does anybody have any questions before we close out the meeting? All right, well, not hearing any. Thanks for joining us today. I'll be sending out a recording of this meeting along with our notes from Terence, probably in the next day or two. And again, if you have any questions moving through the next thinning window on any of the models or anything else, please give me a shout. I'll be around. Thanks.